Welcome to Catholic in America. If you can't find the right partner, does that mean that God wants you to be single? Let's discuss.
Welcome back to Catholic in America. Today I'm joined by my co-host, Father Tom Dillon, and who are you?
Still Father Michael Nixon.
Father Michael Nixon, yeah. So a little change of scenery here.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Nice. My kids raised $10,000. My kids at the Vocation Bible School raised $10,000 for a local crisis pregnancy center and in Tallahassee. So yeah, I told them if they raised $5,000, I'd shave my head. They blew by that, so I had to go for 10. And you had to go big or go home.
That's an expensive haircut.
Absolutely, worth every penny.
Worth every
Praise
penny.
God.
That's a good thing. So, well, today we're talking about is single life a vocation? And if you're not married yet, or you can't find someone, is God punishing you? That's kind of the question here. So, I mean, what should you do if you feel called to marriage, but you can't find a suitable person to marry? I mean, are you called to the single life? I mean, is the single life really a vocation?
I'll start. I'll let you chime in. So, and just to reiterate for those that don't know, so Father Tom and myself were celibate Catholic priests. Father Doug is a married Catholic priest. The bishop knows about it.
Yep. It's
okay. And we're all pastors of parishes, so we're coming from that perspective. I would say first and foremost, every single person, no matter what your state in life, is called to be holy. It's called to follow God. It's called to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. It's called to be a saint. So there's a universal call to holiness for all the baptized that the church teaches about, and that would definitely include those who are not married, those who are not married and are looking to get married or hoping to be married, those who are not married and kind of want to just stay in that spot, those who are discerning a religious vocation as well. So I would say every single person as they are, starting right now, yes, you are called to be holy, and that is the fundamental small v vocation. I think the question that we're asking is something a little bit larger than that. But I'm just going to set that foundation and hand it over to Father Tom.
It's good to know that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I believe that vocation comes from the word to call. So, like, what is your calling? And so, like, what is it? Latin.
Vocari.
Vocari. To call. So, what is your calling in life? What is your direction? Where are you being called? And I think that the fundamental, like in theology, the fundamental calling that all people have, naturally speaking, is towards marriage. Right? It's that God called Adam to be with Eve and Eve to be with Adam. Like, this is the Genesis account, and that actually Adam was lonely in the garden until he had Eve. And so, like, there's this fundamental loneliness that John Paul II writes about in many of his different homilies, which eventually became known as the theology of the body. So, like, we are called, and that specifically speaking, that God calls us to communion. He calls us to relationship. And this is the thing is, he calls us out of isolation, out of individuality, and he calls us into communion. And so, like, the natural vocation that all human beings have by their fundamental nature, like, God created us male and female in his image and likeness. He made us, and that he calls us to be in communion with one another, which is kind of odd for probably some of you who are watching. They're like, "Well, Father Tom, you're celibate. You don't have a wife, and you're not calling." But that's where the natural vocation, the natural calling of human beings, like the fundamental calling, as you said earlier, is to holiness. But, like, the natural vocation is towards the vocation of marriage. And, like, even before Christ established the seven sacraments, like the natural sacrament of marriage.
The primordial sacrament is what John Paul called it.
Yeah, the primordial sacrament of marriage existed prior to that, and that's where God's intention always was for male and female, and that which was also what Jesus says in the New Testament, that which God has joined together must not be divided.
Right.
And so this notion of, like, the fundamental calling, the fundamental vocation of human beings as God's original plan and design is for marriage. Now, there's then the supernatural vocation, which is a prefigurement of what all of us will be like in the next life, because in the next life, that's what Jesus himself says in the New Testament. He says in that, as the Pharisees, I believe it is, come up to him and they say, "Well, this person, this woman over here was
the Sadducees."
The Sadducees. That's what the Sadducees. This woman was married to this brother, and then to this man, and then they had 7 brothers, and so she had 7 or 8 husbands, and now, like, when they get to heaven, whose whose wife is she? Because she was married all these times. And that's where Jesus kind of looks at them as if they're idiots, which I have meditated upon, like Jesus looking upon the imbecility of the elite Sadducees who think they know it. And he's like, yeah, when they get to heaven, they won't be married to any of them because you will be like the angels. Right. Which is also a slap in the face of the Pharisees who didn't believe in angels.
Angels either.
But he's like, you'll be like the angels, right? Because you do not have the giving and selling, you do not have the giving or the giving and taking of marriage. You'll be like that. And so like this understanding that all human beings will be in a relationship directly with God in heaven. This is why the celibate vocation, right, is a prefigurement of that eschatological vocation that all human beings, because we won't be married in heaven, at least by Catholic theology. I know that if there are other religions out there, such as I believe the Mormons, who believe in eternal marriage.
Oh, there's even some Orthodox who believe in, they call it celestial marriage.
Yeah, so celestial marriage. But from our Roman perspective, we have the fundamental vocation, the natural vocation of marriage, and then you have this supernatural vocation of celibacy.
And single life is neither of those.
And single life is neither of those. Yeah. So, but the problem becomes, what happens when, obviously, for the purpose of for this show, what happens when like I feel called to marriage, I don't feel called to celibacy, because celibacy is a supernatural calling, and not everyone is called to the celibate life. And I think it's also important to like distinguish in our language, like the difference between celibacy and chastity.
Yeah.
Like celibacy is the vocation that I'm going to live out now on earth, what all of us will be doing in heaven, which is I am devoted, I am committed to God and to God alone.
Right.
And going any and all.
Correct. Which is why both men can embrace celibacy. Women can embrace celibacy. Is that I'm devoting myself to God and God alone, and I am foregoing, I'm giving up my right to marriage, I'm giving up my interest in marriage to devote myself entirely to God. But then you have other people who are like, well, I don't feel called to that. Like, I don't feel called to celibacy.
Right.
Even though I hear frequently people like, well, I've been celibate for 2 months. I'm like, no, you haven't.
No, you haven't. Yeah.
You might have been chaste. Like, you might not have had sex. Right. Or I've heard married people are like, we've been celibate almost our entire marriage. I'm like, no, you're not. You're married. Like, you might be chaste. You might not be having sex, but celibacy is something different. And I think that many people don't understand like what the Catholic Church actually teaches about celibacy.
Right.
But in that sense, like you then have people who are like, when they figure out like what celibacy from the Catholic understanding is, they're like, well, I don't feel called to that, right? I feel called to marriage.
Right.
Yet look at what I have to work with. Like, I can't find anyone.
And that's a real. I know. We all know a lot of people in our families and our parishes, people we work with and love. That's a real struggle for them. They struggle because of that. They desire marriage. They desire a family. To be husbands or wives, be mothers and fathers, and because of circumstances, because of situations, they're not able to do it. Jesus has those words where he says, some are eunuchs because others have made themselves so. Some, some because God made them that way, and some are eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. So he's kind of distinguishing, so those in a sense who are eunuchs, it's kind of a, maybe a sort of a harsh term. It's a strong word there.
Yeah.
But that are, because of the world they're in, because of if they're a man, there's not, a suitable partner for them, or they're a woman, there's not a suitable partner for her. Like, recognize, that is a cross and that is a difficulty. And I think speaks to part of the crisis of the breakdown of the family and of society at whole, as a whole, that we see. And maybe it's to some of the expectations, which we can kind of get into as well.
Yeah. So
you're saying no? I mean, it's in the strict sense, no. In the strict sense,
as an accidental vocation that, you can't have a vocation. Maybe put it this way: you can't have a vocation that I can leave tomorrow if something better comes along. Yeah, that's not what we mean by vocation.
Part of the capital V vocation, right? Sorry, no. Part of the capital V vocation, though, is that you're committed.
Yeah.
And there's a lifelong commitment to this, and that's why we made commitments to celibacy in front of the bishop. You made commitments to your wife.
And you have two, in that
I have two.
If your wife were to pass away, God forbid, because you like her much more than we like you,
we were thinking about don't blame you for.
That you're bound by those promises of celibacy as well. So So
there's that, and that's kind of the big thing is there's a commitment in celibacy, there's a commitment in marriage. And I think that it's also recognizing that a true vocation, which is your fundamental calling in this life where you'll experience God's love, is found through commitment. And that's where a lot of times, because the other problem is this, in the dating world, as most people who date, and we're aware because we deal with the dating world and with people in that world, like a lot of times there's people with commitment issues.
Yeah.
And they don't want to commit.
Right. Yeah.
And so like there's also can be this kind of, which is like you get into this kind of this sloppy, like where we had the guy our professor in the seminary who I love his quote. He's like, sloppy speech, messy mind gets you in trouble every time.
Yeah.
So people use the word vocation
Yeah.
for what am I called to do right now versus, so like in that sense, like maybe you might be called to be single right now.
Right.
But
And
then
I think it's confusing because in school you have vocational trade schools
Correct.
and things
You
like
have the
that. So
vocation
it's
of-
very similar languages, and people ask.
Yeah, so people
"You gonna
use
be a
the
doctor?
language.
You feel called to be a doctor even, so yeah.
Correct.
it
So
can
I feel
be
called to be a
confusing.
doctor. I feel called to be a fireman. I feel called to be a garbage man.
Right.
I feel actually. I hear garbage men make actually a lot of money.
Yeah, that's
Especially
right. It's getting better.
But
yeah.
the point being is like I feel called, but like you can also walk away from these things, or it's actually it's not your ending goal of where you're being called, and so that's the thing is like part of it is the sloppy speech. Like it's we're using these words interchangeably when we're talking about like a ending goal in this, and where am I being called to a commitment, versus people like, well, I feel called, like my vocation is the single life. Well, that might be where God is calling you right now, but is that your fundamental vocation? And in the theological sense, no.
Right.
Right? No,
Right.
but it's also the other thing. You don't want to jump into a vocation, a calling, a permanent vocation, without doing your necessary prep work. And that's the thing. It's like once people are actually committed, they want a spouse, like especially in the Tinder world that we live in today, as well as the pornography-induced world and all the different problems that are causing breakdowns in relationship and communication, things like that.
And fear to commit.
And fear to commit, commitment issues. I mean, we have couples we have single persons who are terrified of divorce, and so many people are not getting married because they're terrified of divorce, or they're terrified of the divorce rate and things like that. Even though actually, there's a lot of things that could be done to mitigate that. Like the divorce rate's not actually as bad as people think, especially for people who are prepared. But there's that whole thing. Is like people are like, well, I don't want to experience divorce. And so I'm just going to stay perpetually single. Like that's where I feel God is calling me.
You know, and you think about it, you're saying something about preparation for your vocation and taking time in that calling. I mean, to be a priest, it's 8 to 10 years. I mean, and there's lots of couples that are engaged for 2, 3, 4 years, and so taking time with it doesn't mean that you're not going into that vocation.
But here's
time to prepare
here's the
for
thing.
it.
I don't think that couples, though. I mean, to discern a supernatural vocation, especially celibacy, because celibacy is weird.
Yeah.
I'm just
And
like
tough.
practical-
It can be tough.
tough and weird. I don't think that you necessarily you need to take 8 years to discern a marriage. I think that actually, generally speaking,
Right.
I think that from my analysis of how
It's natural.
it's natural. Like you need about 2 years to discern it, maybe 3. But now you have also people who are perpetually dating,
Right.
like and stay in these long-term perpetual dating relationships. And then the question becomes why, right?
Afraid to. Yeah. So can I say this that
And I'm not condemning, by the way, for our viewers, I'm not condemning people who stay in long-term relationships, but there can be a point of like, why are we delaying commitment?
Yes, that official commitment before God that we want. Because what happens when you're married is that God takes the goodness of that natural reality and raises it to the level of a sacrament. So there now becomes a well of supernatural grace as well. We want that for people. So I would say this is not a condemnation of someone who's struggled, and God knows we've been there with people who are in that struggle. The Lord feels your pain, who are longing for a spouse, who can't find it, maybe have had their heart broken or had a committed relationship and it fell apart for reasons that weren't their fault. So like God is with you there. So I would say maybe putting it this way: a vocation cannot be based on either fear or selfishness, and that's where the question. Because I think someone could be in good conscience called, to follow Jesus. Maybe they have a professional call that demands a lot of their time. Say they're a doctor or they're, a missionary, or they're they're pouring themselves out for something, and they never meet somebody in that context. They never have, and they've never made formal vows. They never become a lay consecrated or consecrated virgin, which are vocations in the church that people who are not married maybe want to pursue and discern, because those are beautiful vocations. And they're still holy. They're still living that call of holiness. I think we've had some people canonized even in the past, the 20th century, Saint Giuseppe. I'm blanking on his name. But
what about the new young man, the one who died?
Carlo Acutis.
Yeah, so he was the video gamer.
Pier Giorgio Frassati, who was 24 years old and was living his vocation. Again, if he lived longer, he died at 24. Maybe it's possible that he would have gotten married. But in a sense, like there's people who are heroically living a vocational impetus towards gifts, because we have to live gift. That's what marriage should be. We're making a gift of ourselves. Priesthood should be the same thing. And so if somebody's saying, like, I'm not going to do this because I want to protect my retirement plan, I don't want to get married because I want to, I lose all my benefits from work, or I'm afraid of the future, or I'm afraid of divorce, like that's the place where God's inviting us to conversion. To say, like, all right, can we step out of that towards this next step, or whatever that might be, which is maybe openness towards marriage, or towards maybe it is priesthood or a religious life that person is avoiding, and to be able to honestly discern that as well.
Yeah. So you were talking a minute ago about how there's people that are having a hard time committing. I mean, and that's kind of become the kind of subculture, if you will, to a certain extent. It's called maybe the hookup culture as well. And so, I mean, a majority of the people right now are in that culture. So, and these people, there's lots of them. We did a show on this about not getting married, but that may not have an interest in getting married. How do you date? How do you navigate that? If you're someone who's feeling a call to marriage, you know you're called to marriage, and you're seeking that call out. How do you navigate this in a culture where people just want to date?
Can I say something to this? I'm a man, so I'm gonna blame guys here, or say a word to the gentleman, maybe some of whom might be watching this or listening to this, like that. A big part of the problem here is that men not knowing how to be men not knowing how to, that God has called you to be leaders, God has called you to lay down your life for a bride, God has called you to be fathers, which involves giving up the things maybe that you like to do, that your personal preferences, which involves conversion and turning away from the brokenness of this world, which includes pornography, which I think pornography keeps a lot of men caught in bad cycles, which keeps them from committing themselves or loving a woman well.
Well, and also, but the other problem with pornography is that it creates unrealistic expectations.
Absolutely.
And therefore, when you're confronted with someone else who doesn't meet this ridiculous expectation that's been indoctrinated and brainwashed into persons who use pornography regularly, like they're oftentimes not satisfied. And so, like, not only that, but like it has physiological things like pornography and masturbation, right, is gratifying, like temporarily gratifying. But then likewise, relationships are not always temporarily gratifying. As soon as it entails difficulty, struggle.
Relationships are exhausting.
Exactly. Just like, and then we can say that because we have a relationship with God and the church, which is, the church is exhausting.
Yeah.
Right. But at the same time, like it's an exhaustion that leads to intimacy, and which leads to companionship, and which leads to that, versus pornography over here. But now we have a generation of pornography addicts, which is, rampant because of the phone, that people basically have access to it. And so it's leading into unrealistic expectations, though. And that, even secular sources are waking up to this.
Yeah.
It's like it's leading up. It's a recognition of all the body images that women, because they can't meet men's expectations, right? Because it's an engorged, inflamed, and unhealthy, demonic.
It is starting to turn the other way too. Women are starting to view men in that way as well, where a man can't meet up to a female's expectations either, and so it's
absolutely. And this is on both sides with it. I was speaking specifically to men to say like how important fathers are, how important brothers are, how important men that are encouraging each other to be better, to be holier, to be virtuous. All the things are so important, because it's from that place, as a son, as a brother, and as a friend, that you can recognize that God is calling you to lay down your life for bride, to pursue a woman, which is risky. And there's something, one of the things about video games and pornography and the internet culture that way, is there's no risk involved other than your soul. So in a sense, it's very easy to put all our energy into that and to be drawn into that, because actually risking with another person can be that much harder. Even looking at the way the hookup apps are set up, like I put a little bit of risk because I know the other person has already risked towards me. I've never swiped one of these apps, but it's a swipe and a swipe. You both swipe each other like, oh, this person is interested in me. There's not that risk of having to go out to another human being and talk to them and engage with them. There's like does that person pass whatever filters I have?
My metrics.
My metrics, do they look good enough? according to-
do we have the same hobbies, same interests, and things like that? But there's also the thing is like, there's not like asking a person that on a date is very different than reading about it, and so that you already know what you're getting into. So there's no vulnerability there.
Yeah.
There's also that. I mean, but it's part of like the fun thing about the dating thing is like it is awkward. Like, it's awkward because like you're both done, but now it's all done behind a screen, or a lot of it is done behind a screen, which is why actually the more that happens, the more that it becomes harder and harder to actually get engaged in that uncomfortable meeting and things like that.
Which the relationship's going to continue to have uncomfortable moments from the moment you first start dating to you're married for 55 years. Yeah. And so if you're conditioning ourselves, and we are doing this to young people, this is society as a whole, apps, more acutely, is teaching them as soon as you feel uncomfortable, you need to bail. If it's uncomfortable, there's something wrong with it. And just to tell young people, particularly when we're talking about dating and the vocation of marriage, that is just not true. That's where the good stuff happens, is in the midst of the uncomfortable. How do we overcome that? How do we learn to communicate and talk and move forward?
Because I would say, in terms of kind of bringing us back to the vocation thing, no one is called to the bachelor life. Right. Yeah. And even I do take offense at times. I'm not sure you do, but people are like, I even have my sisters at times will tell me, they're like, "Oh, you're a bachelor." I'm like, "I'm not a bachelor."
No.
Like, I might be a jerk. I might live by myself, but I was like, I'm not a bachelor, and we're not called. No one's called to the bachelor life, which is the bachelor. At least the classic bachelor, at least from like the 1940s and 50s, was the guy who has a little black book who goes through.
Fonzie.
Fonzie. The bachelor. The perpetual dater who's never committing and always plays, and likewise, it's more about the emotional gratification and the pleasures that can be done. Like, no one is called to the bachelor life. And that's where sometimes I think that this language of like people who sometimes are talking, well, I'm called to the single life. Well, I think the first thing that has to be asked is, like, are you talking about you're called to the perpetual dating? Like, you're called to just date and play around but not commit? Because then you also now have the opposite perspective, is you have people who desperately, and I know I have some good friends who desperately would want to get married, but every time that they get into a relationship, they constantly get burned by people who have very low standards, right? And that now these people, and that's the thing, is like when you start looking into standards, like what is a realistic expectation versus an unrealistic expectation? Do we have to spend all our time together? On the other hand, do we like this expectation of, okay, well, we're going to hook up and like you're going to take your clothes, and now the major problem with seeing nudes and texts and things like that, and so like all these things, people are like, I don't want that. And that's just their delude. There's just this deluge.
Some of this is encouraged from the culture itself. I mean, like almost every TV show you have about these single people who may or may not be looking for love, but are involved in this hookup culture. I mean, I remember Seinfeld. You had 4 characters in their late 30s who still weren't really married, and you had 2 or 3 of them that wasn't even seeking to be married. They were just out having a good time, as they say, and I remember there was one episode where George told Jerry that, you can't just go up and talk to her because you'll be passing the other side. I mean, I don't have the guts to go up and just talk to a girl. You can't pass the other side without me. And there's almost this idea of that's where our culture is as you were saying, hide behind a screen because, I don't want to pass the other side, that discomfort of having to go up and be rejected. And we've taught people not to be rejected. But you have these TV shows about it. I mean, well, for that matter, look at Marvel. I mean, all those superheroes, every one of them are single. And so, I mean, this is what you kind of see throughout the culture. So it's definitely, it's what people see now. I mean, when I was growing up, you guys maybe not as much. I grew up in the 70s, so I was still watching old 60s reruns. But I'm watching I Love Lucy. She's married. I'm watching Leave It to Beaver. They're married. Brady Bunch. All these kinds of things. Happily married.
Dick Van Dyke.
Yeah, Dick Van Dyke. But then you come to now and you have, there was a show where the parents weren't even on the show. It was a nanny that was watching them. They went on a cruise for 3 months. It was, I can't remember the name of the show now, but it was on Disney. But most of the Disney shows do not have.
You have teenagers. You know more of these things.
So, I do. I had kids and now teenagers. And so most of these Disney shows, they're all about where the parents are absent and where the people who are there are single and living this perpetual single life and loving it, by the way. And so, I mean, from a young age, these kids are seeing that and seeing that's life. They're not seeing the idea of the sanctity of marriage and the goodness of marriage that you used to see in these shows back in the 70s. And so I think there's some of this that's kind of been taught to them that this is the way we move forward with all of this.
Can I bring up something with this? Because we're talking about culture out there. Like, where do you think the church or Christian culture or Catholic culture maybe has been one of the culprits here as far as maybe keeping people from taking those commitments towards marriage, or where could we do a better job? First, there's something just off the bat for me is I think sometimes we set this unrealistic expectation towards marriage. People hear the beautiful church teachings on marriage, theology of the body, which are awesome and true and good. Then marriage becomes this sort of like almost, unattainable thing that you have to be perfect, and you have to, and your partner has to be perfect too, and they have to do everything perfectly, and they have to lead the family in prayer perfectly, and they have to have gone. If you're marrying a husband, he has to have gone to the seminary for just the right amount of time before he left the seminary for the right reasons to then marry you, and has like a
even
huge
our marriage
paying job.
Even our marriage prep, we're asking people, do you understand what you're getting into, and are you taking this very seriously, because we're trying to prevent some of the things that we're seeing in married life. And so I think there is, to a certain extent, that we should be telling people how serious this sacrament is, and the kind of commitment that they need to be making to it. But I suppose that can be scary
Or
to someone
helping,
who's not really willing to.
I think as a church, oftentimes people who aren't married can feel very alienated in the church, and that's another thing that we do very poorly, is maybe helping them to feel included, a part of what we're doing, a part of what's going on in the life of the church. Because that's where you're going to meet good people, friends, and potentially people you can date and marry.
Yeah, but I'd also add into the conversation though that there's a counter narrative and there's a counter ideology, which is obviously found within that you can craft your own vocation, and and whatever you craft is just as good as anyone else's vocation. And so like when you get into all the different letters of not just LGBTQ, but now you start getting into all the different types of letters and things like that, where you have polyamorous, you have all these different type of understandings. Well, this is my identity. This is who I am. But involved in that identity is also there's part of it where this intersects with vocation. So, for instance, now you have persons who are saying in the community, well, I don't have any sexual appetite whatsoever. I'm just going to not live a celibate one, but I just have no sexual appetite, which is actually possibly can be a sign of repression, right? And severe review. But now it's being championed. Well, if that's the way you feel, you are you, and you are okay with however you are, and so now that becomes you. And so like now it becomes like in the society that we have is like anyone can kind of craft for themselves a vocation. That makes sense, because there is no actual capital V vocation. There is no actual universal vocation. Now your vocation, your calling, is just as valid and just as acceptable and just as good as anyone else's. And so, like, well, I'm called, well, what if I feel called to be in an open marriage, or what if I be called to be in a polygamous relations, or a polyandrous, or a polyamorous, or and so there's this notion of where there's this been loss of like, no, there is a fundamental calling. There is and actually a lot of times that when we don't live up to that, like there's reasons, and not everyone's at fault for why they might not be able to live out their vocational calling in the larger sense. But that's the same thing. And also now we have a generation where there's not a lot of available good options.
Yeah.
Or at least it's hard to find them.
Absolutely.
So people who actually are seeking.
And that's why, again, I go back to the men of like being called to take responsibility, called to make a difference in your life, called to become the men that God has called you to be, which is not just being macho or being like, I'm a breadwinner and I'm a, it's called having a heart like Jesus and seeking to serve. So just a word to men, like, be a man of service, a man for others.
We can lead the way.
We can
lead the way. So in this situation, as we're talking about, what if you are a failure, or are you a failure? That's the question. Are you a failure?
Yes.
If you're called to marriage.
What are you saying?
Are you a failure if you're called to marriage, but you just can't find that suitable partner?
No, I think of, and I'm blanking on her name right now, is one of Therese's sisters, St. Therese of Lisieux, had a sister, I'm blanking on her name, And she struggled because actually all 5 of the Martin girls, they all became nuns, but the one sister tried a couple of different convents, felt she was called to be a nun, felt that vocation from the Lord, and never really was able to find one. And so in a sense, that's maybe a different, they lived in a different time than we do, where people are looking
the opposite. They're all looking to be married.
Looking to be married. And so there's something about that. I think there can be some heroic virtue in that. There's definitely can be sanctity within that. And I do think that's, you can't, marriage is a vocation that requires another person, and them being available and saying yes and everything else. You can't force that. And so there's a certain mystery to it, certain kind of providence with it as well. But I think within that, you're saying, well, even though I haven't found this person, this is what I feel called to. There's a hurt maybe in my heart here, a pain that I feel, an absence. How can I be a gift out of that place? Because I think when people live as a gift out of that place, man, there's some incredibly fruitful and holy lives that can be exhibited.
Yeah, I do think also though that having realistic expectations of, and that goes from men having realistic expectations of women, but it also goes to women having realistic expectations of men. Because I mean, generally speaking, women and men are very different, and like there has to be that expectation because sometimes you have this romantic sense of, well, he's going to be this over here. And Jordan Peterson has some really interesting, pretty amusing things on women dating and men dating and what women's expectations are, and the inordinate, sometimes unrealistic expectations.
It's not a big deal. He's 6'5". He's got a six-figure income. He's
exactly
plays guitar and he's a mechanic and
loves his mother.
Sweet, loves his mother.
So part
not
of
too
it,
much.
But having realistic expectations of what a relationship looks like. And that's why the gospel is actually the best way of patterning our relationship, because like Christ, his expectation of the church is that we're holy, but he doesn't expect us to be perfect. Right? He asks us to be holy. He encourages us to be holy. He also has expectations of holiness. There's also consequences to our actions when we fail, like we have a conversation.
But he lays his life down for us to become holy.
Absolutely.
Right.
Like even St. Paul in Ephesians 5 talks about like he lays his life down. He cleanses, he washes his bride, the church, making us white. That grace, that baptismal garment that we have. Like that's something I think that recognizing, okay, is this person willing to sacrifice, lay down themselves, maybe not their lives, but in a sense their lives for you to become a better person. Not just that like, oh, this person doesn't meet my expectations, so I'm going to reject them. And not that we have to be like, I'm okay with horrible or abusive or manipulative behaviors because maybe I can change them. But it is saying like, okay, am I becoming the kind of person, kind of man, or the kind of woman that I'm called to be? And is this person someone that's also striving towards that? And can we do it together? And
So I got a couple more questions, but the one question that's kind of off the beaten path a little bit, but I wanted us to talk about just for a second is what do you say to a widow or a widower? Someone whose spouse has died, probably untimely, and maybe they're young enough they could possibly remarry, or maybe, look, there's all kinds of stuff that, there's all kinds of people who get married once they move into assisted living and those sorts of things. So what do you say to someone whose spouse has passed and they say,
I got a lot of stuff to say on this.
Yeah, I just feel like I don't think I need to be, married, or I'm living into a particular state.
Absolutely. I would say, as St. Paul would say, if your husband or wife has died, it's probably better to stay unmarried at that point and to dedicate yourself to, this is where religious orders actually come from, the order of widows in the early church, because the early church was very good at recognizing marriage was pointing us not to itself, it's not an end in and of itself, the relationship was pointing beyond itself towards heaven. So in a sense, you're preparing now for heaven. So I think the rush towards someone's a widow or a widower, particularly widowers, they kind of, they've kind of become, because they're more rare for a guy who's in his 70s to all of a sudden now be single. This move towards like, oh, you definitely need to start dating and marrying. And there's something there that I'm like, man, there's just something that I think is accepting a premise that I fundamentally disagree with, that you have to have this married person in order to be happy or to be holy. So I also see the other side of this too, where people do start getting into the dating scene, and I'm shocked and amazed, maybe I shouldn't be, that all notions of morality that we would expect of a 15-year-old when they're dating
Yeah.
seem to get tossed out. And this is not universal, but seem to often get tossed out for people in their 60s or 70s who start dating because of performance-enhancing drugs and stuff that are now available. That that to me is astonishing. That this becomes the norm and of a hookup culture for senior citizens.
Shacking up.
There is
Shacking up,
yeah.
hooking up, yeah.
And so tell them, look, the reason why you don't have sex outside of marriage is not because you could have gotten pregnant, which you're not in danger of now. It's because it's a lie and because it's saying something blasphemous with your bodies. So tell them they're called to chastity, they're called to integrity in the relationships. Is a challenge for a lot of them. And a lot of them lose relationships when they try to start living that way. So anyway,
Sure.
I think that any person in that situation should strongly consider, is God calling me to remain unmarried for the sake of the kingdom of God?
Right.
Not that every person who gets married as a second marriage is bad. There's lots of beautiful and good ones.
Of course.
Yeah. I mean, because we probably both encountered, all three of us might have encountered the situation of, well, if we get married, then we're going to lose our benefits.
Yes.
Yep.
And if we're going to lose that, and I'm just like, that's the consequence of marriage, right? And I understand where you're coming from and things like that. But I was like, but shacking up, just living together and acting like your husband and wife.
It's a much bigger benefit you're losing by that, which is,
So I was going to say, like,
eternal
there's
salvation.
there's a moral quality to that, as well as like there's also the whole point. And I'm not trying to be condemning to people who do that, because I've talked with them, I know them, I've friends. I know it's these people, but it's the same point. It's just there's the point of you have children and you have grandchildren oftentimes, and you still have a model and example that you're called to live for other persons. And that's why, like, we don't just need parents, we also need grandparents who provide good moral example. And that's the problem, is like, as our society has become more and more blended with boundaries, it's not just affecting young people, it is affecting people in the middle years of life. And now it's affecting and going into elderly population, which you would not normally expect that from. But
Right.
But the whole point is, like, are you committed? And at the end of the day, our greatest commitment has to be to God.
Yeah.
Right. And if God is giving us a relationship, He's also calling us to commit ourselves to a relationship, or to not commit ourselves to a relationship and be committed to Him.
Yeah.
And so that's that whole point. Like, could a person be called to be single and to prepare themselves for heaven? Everybody is always called to be committed and to be committed to God and to prepare themselves for heaven, regardless of whether they're married, regardless if they're celibate, or regardless if they find themselves in a state where they don't have a spouse. But what I think that the danger falls into is more of a spiritual danger, which is an ideological one. So, like, the philosophy.
Yeah.
Like, are we called to commitment, and are we called to companionship and relationship? Or am I just called to be immature?
Yeah.
Like, and that's the thing. And that's why there's many people who find themselves not being able to find a spouse, but they desire that commitment, they're looking for it. In that case, it's not on them. There's other persons who are living it, who I would posit and I would assert are living in a state of perpetual adolescency. And that just because you're 50 or 60 doesn't mean you're not acting like an adolescent.
Yeah.
Right.
So, okay. So for someone who maybe in that state, but particularly we've been talking about more of the single life itself. So if I can't find a spouse, does that mean that God's calling me to be a priest or religious?
Perhaps. Maybe this is another stage of your life where or a consecrated virgin or a consecrated layperson. There's lay consecrated in the church, and consecrated virginity, diocesan hermits. There's different ways of living this that maybe you haven't really explored before. A religious order. I thought about being a priest. I'm not really attracted to the diocesan priesthood or being a parish, but then all of a sudden being a missionary priest. So it's a perhaps. I wouldn't say necessarily, but that does need.
But there's also religious brother. There's religious sister. Right. So, like, there's the whole point of, like, I can dedicate myself to charity. Like, that's actually where obviously religious sisters came from, because they don't experience. Religious sisters don't have holy orders the way that ministerial priests do, but they do have that vocation where they can dedicate themselves to the needs of the church as well as to building up the kingdom of God.
Which is the highest vocation.
And being spiritual mothers. And that's the whole, being spiritual mothers. And then you have brothers who, religious brothers and so forth. So, I mean, you definitely have that. But you also have, again, the little known thing that we really don't have a lot of nowadays, which is lay consecrated.
Yeah.
Like persons who have consecrated themselves to God, dedicated themselves to God, have foregone or given up on marriage.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so, like, they're just like, I'm foregoing, I'm putting that aside, and I'm going to dedicate myself to the needs of the church. And that doesn't mean that you have to work in a parish.
Right.
You just you dedicate
You have a job in the world.
They have a job in the world. They
yeah.
dedicate themselves to the needs of the church, which is the larger church. And but the point being is like there's a point where they commit and they are committed.
So what are some of those things? What are some of those ways? I mean, how if someone was like, and I've never even heard of these things. All I've ever really heard of is religious life and priestly. I mean, I've never heard of consecrated virgins. All these things. How would they go about looking for something?
Yeah, so
like
most
this?
dioceses will have someone who can help direct you towards the process of discerning consecrated virginity, which is a specific order within the church for women. There are some organizations within the church like Opus Dei that has certain mechanisms towards a lay consecrated life or a third order life as well, and religious orders like the Dominicans or Franciscans.
And Carmelites,
as well. So, like within the churches, the church has been asking and answering this question for a very long time. We have our own sort of recent manifestations of struggles with it because we've never seen marriage break down like we have in the past 60 years. I don't think that's ever happened outside of like the plague or world wars that deprive entire generation of men from society. So we have our own kind of manifestation of that. But the church has been answering this for a long time. So I would check out with your diocesan offices about if there's third order Carmelites or Franciscans or Dominicans, or if there's someone who can talk about being a consecrated virgin or a diocesan hermit, because those are all really viable options.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you guys for the conversation, and thank you for joining us on Catholic in America. We'll see you next time.